Before the video starts, I need to say something about the voiceover. As you already know, I have been using AI clone of my voice for the videos I made in this channel for years now, and there's been a lot of complaints. So for this video, I'm going to use my real voice. Please let me know if it sounds better or worse. Thank you. So, a couple days ago, I was browsing the second-hand market, looking for something fun to play with, and I saw this 2019 MacBook Pro 16-inch for only $450. I couldn't believe the price of this machine had dropped down to this level. I know this is an Intel Mac, which is considered garbage compared to an Apple Silicon one, at least to most people. It's so much worse in so many aspects, including performance and efficiency, and that's probably why it's so cheap right now. I actually sat on this listing for a day before deciding to grab it, mostly because $450 for a machine that once cost well over $2,000 felt almost too good to pass up, even knowing what I was getting into. I was once an M1 MacBook user, and I'm well aware of how good of a machine it was, and still is. However, since selling my M1 MacBook Air a few years ago, I've been using Linux exclusively, and now I'm more interested in putting Linux on MacBooks to see how it performs. What I mean is, I no longer want to use macOS as my daily operating system, so the macOS side of the laptop isn't what's making it attractive to me. Yes, I know there's a project called Asahi Linux for Apple Silicon Macs. In fact, I already tried it some years ago. Last time I checked though, it was still mostly a work-in-progress project, and you'll run into a lot of trouble if you try to make it your main operating system. Apple also constantly changes things, and sometimes that leads to failures when putting Asahi Linux. With Intel Macs though, I think Linux compatibility is much better based on my previous experience. Everything should just work out of the box, since all Intel Macs hardware is relatively old now, and Linux typically has issues with the latest chips. I was so wrong about that though. I just didn't realize it yet when I decided to buy the MacBook. The major thing I had no idea about is this thing called the T2 security chip. Before I switched to the M1 MacBook, I was rocking a 2017 MacBook Pro, and back then the T2 chip hadn't been released yet. So that's the reason I was totally unaware of it, not to mention how it could impact Linux compatibilities on MacBooks. From what I understand now, Apple introduced the T2 chip to handle things like encrypted storage, Touch ID, and the Hey Siri always-on microphone, basically acting as a security co-processor sitting between the hardware and the rest of the system. Great for macOS. Not so great if you are trying to run a different operating system on the same hardware. Now that I have done some research after getting my machine, I've learned that it's not only providing security features for macOS, but also preventing many components from working out of the box on Linux. Such components include the internal SSD, keyboard, trackpad, audio, and Wi-Fi. All these components now require special drivers that you won't find in the Linux kernel. As I said, I only learned this after I already had the MacBook Pro in my hands, so I was quite devastated, to be honest. I was hoping it would be an easy job to turn it into a Linux laptop, just like so many of the older MacBooks. But anyway, I still wanted to try installing Linux on it, so let's get started. By the way, I did all my research on this MacBook after I got it, and I hadn't realized how bad the experience with macOS would be. Everything is so slow, so sluggish. This MacBook Pro is still very well spec'd, even by today's standards. It's got an Intel i9 CPU, 16GB of RAM, a 1TB SSD, and a Radeon 5500M 8GB GPU, but the performance is just horrible. There's a 1 or sometimes even 2 second lag every time I click something on the screen. Even when I'm simply typing, it feels sluggish. It's so unbelievably slow. I couldn't quite comprehend it myself. Coming from an M1 MacBook Air, which I remember as basically instant for everything, this felt like going backwards in time by a decade, not 5 or 6 years. I googled the performance issue and found tons of similar complaints. Most people blame the latest macOS update, Tahoe to be exact. I had to follow some guides to turn off effects like the fancy transparency and reduce the animations just to make it somewhat usable. It still feels sluggish frequently, but I got used to it after a few hours. All these headaches just gave me another incentive to switch to Linux. I was hesitant when I learned about the trouble with the T2 chip, but then then the horrible performance of macOS Tahoe dropped my interest in using macOS on it to zero instantly. So maybe that's a good thing. With all that being said, now I need to decide on the distro, which is always a difficult decision to make. Previously, I have been a diehard Ubuntu fan, and it seems Ubuntu would be a solid choice here too. But since early this year, I have completely switched to CachyOS on both my desktop PC and my main laptop, which is a Lenovo ThinkBook. So naturally, I just want the same experience across all my devices. Fortunately, it seems CachyOS also provides good support for T2 MacBooks. There's a dedicated page for getting T2 MacBooks working on CachyOS, and it doesn't seem too complicated at first glance. The best news I learned is that CachyOS can just detect the hardware during installation and install the correct kernel, one that's already compiled with all the drivers T2 machines need, so I don't have to do much extra work to get major components like the keyboard and touchpad working. Of course, this made me very happy, and I instantly made the decision to go with CachyOS again. So I followed the instructions on the T2 MacBook page. First, I needed to back up the Wi-Fi firmware, so I have internet connection during the installation. The backup part went smoothly without any problems. But later on, I have to spend more time than expected dealing with the Wi-Fi connection. I'll explain further in a bit. Now I have to prepare the disk partitions. The guide strongly advises a zero boot setup, so I figure it's wise to keep macOS around. Since I want to use Linux mainly on this device, I only gave 20% of the storage to macOS, leaving 800 GB for Linux. Should be plenty for a secondary computer. This step was easy. Next, disable secure boot. Also easy. Reboot MacBook and keep pressing Command and R to boot into recovery mode. Then go to Utilities and select the No Security option, as well as the option to allow booting from removable media. Once rebooted, I downloaded the CachyOS ISO, which surprisingly took a long time to finish. I decided not to follow the official method of running the ISO to the SanDisk USB drive because I've been using Radeon on this drive for a few years now, and it's been extremely convenient to have multiple installation images all in one place. So I just copied the ISO to the drive. With everything in hand, I rebooted the MacBook while holding the Option key and successfully got into the Radeon menu, then chose CachyOS to boot. Unfortunately, I hit my first major issue. The boot process took an insanely long time and got stuck at the copying rootfs image to RAM stage. It looked like it was going to take weeks to finish, so I googled how to avoid it, and it turned out there's an option to disable the copy to RAM step entirely. All I had to do was boot with GRUB, an older but still more popular boot manager used by most Linux distros, and edit the kernel command line parameters. As you can see here, the copy to RAM option defaults to auto, and I need to set it to N. The problem is, for some reason, using the arrow keys to move the cursor was extremely slow. This is real-time footage, and it's really testing my patience. Finally, I edited it, and I needed to press Ctrl+X to save the edit, but it seems that it didn't work. The other key that's supposed to work is F10, but well, as you can see, this is the stupid keyboard with a touch bar, and the touch bar isn't working at all. So I went and grabbed my PC's keyboard dongle and used the F10 key to save the edit. I had to endure the slow-moving cursor thing again, by the way. And finally, the copy to RAM message was gone. Unfortunately, the boot still took so long, it seemed stuck forever. This got me thinking the slow performance of the USB drive was a major bottleneck here. So maybe the USB port wasn't functioning properly. I was using a dongle with 3 high-speed USB 3 ports, and I guess there was a chance the USB 3 feature wasn't initializing properly, and they were falling back to super slow USB 1 speeds. Luckily, I have another cheap dongle with fake USB 3 ports, meaning they're actually only USB 2 but labeled like USB 3. Switching to this cheap knockoff dongle finally solved my problem. Ironically, even the copy to RAM step went pretty quickly this time, and within a minute or two, I was already in the live system. Now, the first thing I noticed was that the keyboard, the touchpad, and even the touch bar were already working properly. This meant that CachyOS had correctly detected my T2 MacBook and booted with the kernel that already had all the needed drivers compiled in. This is such great news. Okay, the next biggest challenge was getting Wi-Fi working before installation because the Wi-Fi firmware is proprietary. It can't be bundled into the CachyOS T2 kernel like everything else. I followed the guide again, and I thought I typed all the right commands, but I couldn't get the Wi-Fi connected. The system recognized the adapter and could find all the Wi-Fi signals, but when I typed in the password, it just wouldn't connect. After a lot of retries, I finally figured out that for some reason, I had skipped the last step, telling the system to switch the network manager's backend and restart the service. But even after that, Wi-Fi was still stuck and waiting for authorization. This step took me something like 15 minutes to figure out, and I tried so many things along the way. But finally, I figured out myself. Turns out I needed to delete the saved network from the network manager first and reconnect Wi-Fi from scratch. And finally, it worked. Now I can finally start installing the system. The only hiccup during installation was the partition configuration. At first, I was going to use the Lemine bootloader since that's what I've been using on my PC. It supports BTRFS snapshots and looks pretty good to my eyes. But then the installer told me I needed an EFI partition of at least 2 GB, and my current one was only 300 MB. I really didn't want to mess with the partitions since that seemed pretty risky, so I went back and chose the legacy GRUB bootloader instead, which should work with a much smaller EFI partition. It supports snapshots too, so I didn't have to worry about that. But then again, the installer warned me that it needed at least 512 MB this time. Then I read the rest of the warning, and it said, your system may fail to start. So it's not entirely guaranteed to break. I figured this was close enough, so I just risked it. Much lower risk than adjusting all the partitions in my opinion. So this is my final configuration of the partitions. Then I just hit next, and the system installation went through smoothly. It took much longer than on my desktop PC for some reason, but I didn't see anything actually wrong. It just needed to download and install a ton of packages from the internet. After a long wait, I finally booted into the system. Everything seemed to be recognized and working, except Wi-Fi. Again, I need to run the same commands to get the Wi-Fi firmware installed permanently. A few observations though. First, the entire desktop seems to be rendered by the AMD discrete GPU, not the Intel integrated one. The MacBook is running a bit hotter because of this. I can hear fan noise, which shouldn't be happening while idling. That's something I need to fix. Getting hybrid graphics to work properly is apparently a major headache, so I'm not going to tackle that today. I'll save it for a follow-up video once I have actually looked into how deep that rabbit hole goes. The touch bar by default has all the function keys to adjust brightness, audio, and keyboard backlight, and so on, which is really nice. I'm hoping to find ways to configure the touch bar in the future though. Seems like a great place to display something like temperatures or system status. I spent maybe half an hour testing CachyOS on the machine. The overall experience is exactly how I imagined Linux would run on similar hardware. The desktop is extremely responsive. It's a night and day difference compared to macOS Tahoe. 1 minute in, you get a feeling this is the operating system this MacBook actually deserves. I understand Apple as a company has every right to shift focus to their Apple Silicon computers, but they really shouldn't let older devices perform this badly. Apple, of all companies, should be the one optimizing their devices, not the other way around. So this is where I am ending this video for now. It's been a bit more challenging than I expected, but I finally got Linux installed on this machine. There's still a good list of things left to sort out on this computer. The hybrid graphics situation, the fan running when it shouldn't, and whatever I end up doing with that touch bar. So this won't be the last time you see this MacBook on the channel. I'll share more updates in the future. So if you are interested, please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.